Somewhere in London in the summer of 1720, a promoter was selling shares in a company whose stated business purpose was carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. He raised £2,000 in a single morning. Then he left town. This was not the South Sea Company. The South Sea Company was far more sophisticated than that. But this anonymous swindler, whose name history never recorded, understood something the South Sea Company understood too. In the summer of 1720, London had gone collectively insane over paper, and the madness was so complete that people would hand over real money for promises so vague they amounted to nothing at all. What happened in Britain in 1720 was the world's first great financial crash. A company that had never turned a profit, that was built on a trade route that barely existed, that was run by men who were bribing half the government with stock they hadn't issued yet, sent its shares from £128 to £1,000 in 7 months, then watched them collapse to £124 by December, destroying fortunes, ending careers, and pushing people to suicide in the streets of London. Isaac Newton lost what would be millions today. The Chancellor of the Exchequer went to prison. The King's mistress had been bribed with shares, and the man who built the entire scheme, a former legal clerk with no financial training, nearly escaped the country before Parliament caught up with him. This is the story of how Britain nearly bankrupted itself chasing a fantasy. Britain in 1711 had a problem that would be familiar to anyone who has ever lived in a country that just finished a war. The bills had come due, and nobody wanted to pay them. The War of the Spanish Succession had been grinding on since 1701, draining the treasury of money it didn't have. Britain had borrowed heavily to finance armies on the continent, and by 1711 the national debt stood at around £10 million, a sum so vast it was difficult for contemporaries to fully comprehend. The government owed money to thousands of creditors, many of them holding government annuities that paid steady income indefinitely. You couldn't just pay them off. The holders were entitled to annual payments that might stretch for decades. Getting rid of the debt meant convincing all those annuity holders to accept something else instead. Robert Harley, the Lord Treasurer, needed a solution. The Bank of England, his political rival's institution, wasn't going to help him. He needed something new, something that could absorb a chunk of the national debt and give creditors a reason to swap their steady annuity payments for something more exciting. He found John Blunt. Blunt was not an obvious architect of the greatest financial scandal in British history. He was a scrivener by profession, a man who copied out legal documents for a living, who understood the fine print of contracts and the mechanics of debt arrangements. He was sharp, energetic, not particularly educated, deeply ambitious, and had been involved in several smaller financial schemes before Harley approached him. He understood that the essential mechanism of finance is not money, but confidence, the shared belief that something has value, which is entirely separate from whether it actually does. The South Sea Company was incorporated in 1711 with a proposition that seemed straightforward. It would take over a portion of the national debt. In exchange, it would receive a government-guaranteed interest rate and a monopoly on British trade with the Spanish colonies of South America. The vast, fabulously wealthy territories of Peru, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, full of silver mines and exotic goods. The annuity holders could swap their government debt for South Sea Company shares and participate in the profits of this new trade. The problem, which was known to those who looked carefully and carefully ignored by those who didn't want to look, was that Britain had no meaningful right to trade with Spanish South America. Spain controlled those territories, and Spain was the country Britain had just spent a decade fighting. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 gave Britain a single concession: the asiento, the right to supply African slaves to Spanish colonies, plus one ship per year for general trade. One ship. The entire edifice of the South Sea Company's appeal to investors rested on fantasies of South American riches that the actual treaty made nearly impossible. The company's first voyages were modest failures. The trade never materialized in any significant form. By 1718, the company had managed a few slave trading voyages with minimal profit, and its shares were languishing. Any rational analysis of the company's actual business prospects would have produced a valuation somewhere around the share price already trading. But Blunt was not interested in rational analysis. He was interested in what a share price could become if confidence was properly manufactured. In 1719, John Law was transforming France. Law was a Scottish financier, brilliant, reckless, operating in Paris because he was under a death sentence in England for killing a man in a duel. He had convinced the French government to let him consolidate the national debt into shares of the Mississippi Company, which held a monopoly on trade with France's vast North American territories. Law's scheme turned French government debt into shares, inflated the share price through financial mechanisms and propaganda about Mississippi's riches, and for a brief period appeared to be working spectacularly. Mississippi Company shares in Paris were soaring. Paris itself was transforming into a city of new money and new anxieties. Blunt watched Law's scheme from London and understood something important. It was possible to inflate a paper price almost indefinitely, as long as new buyers kept arriving to sustain it. The secret was to keep the mechanism turning. More shares, more buyers, more credit, more price increases that attracted more buyers, while skimming profit from the top before the mechanism failed, which it inevitably would. In January 1720, Blunt presented to Parliament a new proposal. The South Sea Company would take over the entire remaining national debt, something like £31 million. In exchange, the company would issue new shares to all the holders of government annuities. The government would pay the company interest on the converted debt, and the company would sell new shares to the public to raise the cash it needed to pay for the conversion. The mechanics depended entirely on the share price going up. If shares were worth £300, you could offer fewer of them to each annuity holder and still pay their debt off. If shares were £500, fewer still. The higher the price, the more money the company made on each conversion. Blunt understood that his job was to make sure the price went up, and then up more, and then up more still, for as long as possible. To get Parliament to approve the scheme, he first had to get Parliament itself invested in its success. Robert Knight, the company's cashier, maintained what was called the Green Book, a private ledger of shares distributed to influential people without payment, purely as bribes. The shares were entered under fictitious names and could be cashed in whenever convenient. The recipients included the Postmaster General, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Secretary of State, members of the House of Commons, and members of the House of Lords. Lord Sunderland, one of the most powerful men in the government, was to profit £500 for every pound the stock rose. The king's mistress, the Duchess of Kendal, received shares. The king's illegitimate children received shares. Even the king himself held stock and had been made the company's nominal governor. Parliament approved the scheme in April 1720, in a vote whose outcome had been, financially speaking, preordained. Once Parliament had approved the debt conversion, Blunt set the machine running at full speed. The share price had been at £128 in January. Through a combination of optimistic press coverage, prominent names associated with the company, installment subscription plans that let ordinary people buy shares without paying the full price up front, and a steady stream of announcements designed to suggest the company was about to reveal its true potential, the price climbed. By February, it was £175. By March, £330. By May, £550. Exchange Alley in the City of London became the center of a kind of collective derangement. Coffee houses along the narrow lane were so packed with buyers and sellers that people were buying stock at the entrance to one and selling it at a profit by the time they reached the exit on the other side. Brokers posted their prices on boards. Men who had never owned shares in anything stood in line to buy South Sea stock or any of the dozens of new companies that were springing up to catch the overflow of investment mania. The bubble companies of 1720 are worth lingering over because they illustrate how completely reason had left the building. Companies were formed to insure insurance. Companies were formed to import jackasses from Spain, presumably for agricultural purposes, though the prospectus was vague on the specifics. One company promised to develop a perpetual motion machine. Another offered to transform mercury into a malleable fine metal. A company was formed to trade in human hair. Another promised to drain the Red Sea in search of treasure left by the Egyptians when they pursued Moses. One promoter was selling shares in a company to manufacture a gun that fired square bullets, an innovation whose tactical advantage remained unexplained. And then there was the anonymous promoter at the beginning of this story, whose prospectus for a company of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is, raised £2,000 in a morning before its founder collected his money and disappeared. Every one of these companies found buyers. The South Sea Company itself, alarmed at all this competition for investor money, used its influence to push through the Bubble Act of June 1720, which prohibited new joint stock companies from operating without royal charter. The act was designed to funnel all investment money back toward South Sea stock specifically. It worked, briefly. South Sea shares jumped to £890 when the act passed. By August, the price touched £1,000. Isaac Newton had sold his South Sea shares in April at a profit of £7,000. He watched the price continue to climb for 4 months. He couldn't stand it anymore. He bought back in near the top. He eventually lost £20,000, somewhere between 2 and 4 million pounds in modern values, and said afterward, with perhaps more candor than a man of his reputation would normally allow, "I can calculate the movement of the stars, but not the madness of men." The genius who had described the laws governing the physical universe could not protect himself from what was happening in Exchange Alley. Nobody could explain this at the time, and nobody could stop it. Blunt had been running a machine that required constant acceleration. New buyers had to keep arriving to sustain the price, because the price had no connection to the company's actual earnings, which remained negligible. The South Sea Company's revenue from its actual business, slave trading, and 1 ship per year of general trade was tiny relative to the valuation the market had assigned it. To keep the price rising, Blunt had the company lend money to investors to buy shares. The loans were backed by those same shares as collateral. If you wanted to buy South Sea stock but couldn't afford it, the company would lend you the money to do so, secured against the stock you were buying. This was, in retrospect, a mechanism perfectly designed to accelerate the eventual collapse. If the price fell, the collateral backing, all those loans was worth less than the loans, forcing investors to sell to cover the debt, which pushed the price down further, which made the collateral worth less again. In August 1720, the first installment payments on the subscription shares were due. Investors who had bought on the installment plan now had to make their first cash payment. Many could only do so by selling shares they already owned. The price began to slip, from £1,000 to £900, then to £800. In Paris, John Law's Mississippi Company was already collapsing, and money that had fled Paris for London's apparently safer markets began moving again, this time toward Holland. By September, the price had fallen to £576. By October, £370. By December, £124, essentially back where it had started in January, before anyone had heard of the scheme. In less than 4 months, a company valued at roughly 10 times Britain's annual government revenue had lost 90% of its peak value. The crash spread through the London financial system like a fire in dry timber. Banks that had made loans against South Sea shares found their collateral worthless. Goldsmiths who had extended credit to investors saw their debtors unable to pay. The luxury trades collapsed because the people who had been buying coaches and estates and jewels on paper profits no longer had those profits. Unemployment spread. The bankruptcy courts were overwhelmed. Men who had been prosperous in January were ruined by October. Some made it worse for themselves. The Duke of Chandos had sold £30,000 worth of stock in March and collected a real profit. Encouraged, he bought back in heavily. By May, he held £300,000 of stock. He watched it lose most of its value without selling. Men who had been told repeatedly that the price would keep rising couldn't bring themselves to believe it might stop. The higher the price had climbed, the more certain they had become that it would climb further. Now the opposite logic applied, and they were equally certain the fall was temporary. Blunt's nephew cut his own throat with a razor. Blunt himself, who had wisely sold most of his own shares near the peak in August, narrowly avoided being shot in the street by an angry investor who had lost everything. He retreated to a town outside London and waited for what he knew was coming. Parliament reconvened in December 1720 to widespread public fury. The mood in London was ugly. Pamphlets called for the directors to be thrown into the Thames in sacks of snakes. Satirists compared the directors to ancient tyrants. William Hogarth sketched an allegory of the bubble in which fortune spins her wheel over the ruins of a collapsed civilization, and figures representing fraud, villainy, and folly hand out ribbons to the crowd. The inquiry was conducted by a parliamentary committee, and as it proceeded, the scale of the corruption became clear. Knight, the cashier who kept the green book with the record of all the bribes, fled to Europe before he could be subpoenaed. Parliament sent urgent messages demanding his extradition. Robert Walpole, the powerful parliamentarian who had quietly profited from the bubble himself, but had been politically distant enough from the scheme to seem untainted, worked behind the scenes to ensure Knight was never returned. Knight ended up in the Austrian Netherlands, which had no extradition treaty with Britain, and the Green Book was never seen again. Without the Green Book, the parliamentary inquiry could not fully prove who had been bribed and by how much. Investigators had tracked down what appeared to be about £574,000 in outright bribes slipped into the company's books by Knight under entries labeled sundry. But the paper trail pointed in directions Walpole preferred it not to go, toward the king, toward the Prince of Wales, toward men the government still needed. Blunt was brought before Parliament and questioned at length. He gave up enough names to satisfy the inquiry while, under Walpole's careful management, protecting the people Walpole needed to protect. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Aislabie, was expelled from Parliament and sent briefly to the Tower of London, becoming the most prominent sacrifice. The Postmaster General, James Craggs the Elder, had fallen into deep depression when his son suddenly died of smallpox during the investigation. The night before he was due to be tried and found guilty, he took his own life. Parliament convicted him anyway. Several other ministers resigned or were impeached. The company's 33 directors were stripped of an average of 82% of their wealth, with the confiscated assets distributed to investors as partial compensation. Walpole emerged from the wreckage as Britain's most powerful politician, credited with saving the financial system and the Hanoverian monarchy from complete disgrace. He had in fact done exactly that, through a combination of genuine financial competence and artful corruption management. He became, in the following year, what historians would later call the first British Prime Minister. The South Sea bubble made him. The South Sea Company did not collapse. This is perhaps the most remarkable postscript to the whole affair. The company continued to exist for another century, managing a residual portion of the national debt, maintaining its offices, drawing its government interest payments, employing clerks in rooms that still smelled faintly of ambition. Charles Lamb worked there as a young man in the 1790s and wrote an affectionate essay about its atmosphere of quiet, bureaucratic melancholy. The enterprise that had nearly destroyed British finance became, in its old age, a minor administrative backwater. The ruins of the bubble changed Britain's financial landscape in ways that lasted for generations. Parliament's Bubble Act, which the South Sea Company itself had promoted to kill competition, remained on the books until 1825, over a century, preventing the creation of new joint stock companies without royal charter. This effectively froze British corporate structure at the moment of the crash, and historians have argued that it significantly delayed the development of the corporate financing that would eventually drive the Industrial Revolution. The bubble's aftermath made Britain more conservative about financial innovation, just as the country was about to need that innovation most. The immediate human cost was substantial. Thousands of investors lost everything. The wave of suicides in 1720 was real and documented. The luxury trades that had boomed on paper profits collapsed, throwing artisans and craftsmen out of work. Country estates that had been mortgaged to buy shares were sold to pay debts. Families that had been prosperous were ruined in months. And yet, some historians argue that the South Sea bubble, while a catastrophe for its immediate victims, was not the disaster to the broader British economy that it appeared. Within a few years, trade and industry were recovering. The national debt, which the whole scheme had been designed to manage, was eventually handled through other mechanisms. Britain entered a period of sustained economic growth through the 18th century, building the empire and the industrial base that would make it dominant in the following century. What the bubble changed most permanently was perhaps not the economy, but the culture of finance. The phrase South Sea Bubble entered the language as a synonym for financial delusion, joining tulip mania from the Dutch 1630s as a shorthand for the capacity of apparently rational people to pursue obviously irrational ends. Adam Smith wrote about the bubble in The Wealth of Nations 50 years later as a cautionary tale about the inherent instability of joint stock speculation. Every subsequent financial crisis has been compared to 1720. The pattern Blunt had exploited was not new in 1720 and has not become old since. A plausible story about future profits, prominent names lending credibility, credit extended to buyers to sustain the price, insiders cashing out near the peak, ordinary investors left holding the losses. The Green Book full of names nobody will produce in court. The inquiry that catches the smaller fish while the larger ones negotiate their survival. What Blunt built was not fundamentally different from what has been rebuilt in every generation since. The mechanisms change. The jargon evolves. The basic human capacity for collective self-deception, for seeing in a rising price not evidence of a problem, but proof of an opportunity, for believing that this time is different, appears to be permanent. Isaac Newton, the greatest scientific mind of his age, lost the equivalent of millions watching a price that his own mathematical ability should have told him was impossible. He knew how to calculate where Jupiter would be in 50 years. He could not talk himself out of buying South Sea stock near its peak. He said afterward that he could not calculate the madness of men. He was wrong about that. The calculation is simple. The madness is the same every time. The only thing that changes is the name on the prospectus. In 1720, the name was the South Sea Company. The company was selling British government debt wrapped in stories about South American silver. By August, its shares cost 10 times what they were worth. By December, the price was back where it started, and the men who had sold at the top were counting their money in country houses, and the men who had bought at the top were counting what was left. The anonymous promoter who raised £2,000 for a company of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is, understood something that Blunt and Newton and the Duke of Chandos and the King's Mistress all demonstrated in different ways. In a mania, the nature of the underlying asset barely matters. What matters is the story, and whether people believe it, and whether they believe it long enough for you to get out before they stop.